Hey, discipleship groups, we see the last moments of Jesus with the disciples here, and there's a lot to cover, and I really want to hit three significant things in Mark chapter 14 as Jesus approaches the cross and has the Last Supper and enters into the garden with the disciples. There's three things. The first is we see this beautiful moment of worship and anointing of Jesus. As this woman comes and anoints Jesus, the disciples fuss at the expense of this perfume. And I think it's fascinating for several reasons. One, this is an anointing as Jesus goes to the cross. It is an extravagant opportunity of generosity that this woman displays, but it also shows the disciples still don't get who Jesus is, but this woman who they would view as beneath them does recognize that Jesus is this Messiah, this one who is the Son of God. And so because of that, she extravagantly worships Jesus. I think it's fascinating. One of the themes we see here in Mark chapter 14 is just the frailty of the understanding of the disciples of who Jesus is. And we see this woman understanding, wow, this is the Son of God, and because of that, extreme generosity is going to pour out from me because I'm worshiping the Messiah. For us, I think it's an important question to wrestle with. What does my worship look like? Am I worshiping in complete abandonment through song, through my life, through generosity? There's so many different aspects of that with that. I think of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer quote that says this: "He who would learn to serve must learn to think little of themselves." And this woman really models us in this anointing moment. The second thing we see is Jesus here in the Last Supper. And when you begin to wrestle with the words of, hey, take my body, and it's going to be broken for you, this is my blood, which is poured out from you, I can only imagine the disciples, especially after following this anointing moment early on in chapter 14, where the disciples were like, what is going on here? And not understanding. As this is happening, Jesus, as they approach the Last Supper, as they go into the Last Supper, and even as they go in the garden, one thing that's really fascinating here is that Jesus still holds all power over all circumstances in this. And we see this interesting balance as we approach the Lord's Supper, as we go into the garden, of Jesus holding all things in power, even as he approaches his death. I think that is fascinating. We see this interesting balance of Jesus being fully God yet fully man. We see that tension here. And I think, or I know, it's one thing that's really important about Jesus and his work on the cross is that Jesus is the one who can be this atoning sacrifice. He can be, because he is fully God, yet in his full humanity takes on the sins of the world. I think it's an important tension to recognize here in this text. As we move into the garden from the Last Supper, we see this really interesting thing that we've already talked about, just the frailty of the disciples. We see this early on in the anointing where they're like, Jesus, this is a big waste. We see this predicted as Jesus says, hey, Peter, you're gonna deny me, and Peter like boldly is like, I will not. And then the disciples are like, no, we will not deny you. And then we see it later on in chapter 14 where Peter does deny him after the garden. And then we see in the garden as Jesus is really going to the Father, and we see his humanity played out here. He's like, Lord, like, this is hard. We see the anguish, the burden of Jesus as he's praying to the Father. And we see this important thing as Jesus is wrestling with obedience and the difficulties of obedience. What does he do to overcome this distress? He goes to the Father in prayer. And this is important as we see a glimpse of Jesus and his humanity. What does Jesus do to combat this difficulty? He doesn't try and muscle through it. He doesn't try and act like, man, everything's okay. He goes to the Father in prayer. But in this moment of prayer, we see just the frailty of the disciples. And it's easy to be like, disciples, you still don't get it. But I think it's important for us as we see Jesus do the miraculous in our own life, as we see Jesus again and again provide, as we see Jesus speak to us through his word, how much we are like the disciples in that we will discount his work, or we will not fully trust him, or we'll be asleep on the job, so to speak. And I know as I was reading Mark chapter 14, I personally really identified with the disciples, and over again, just discounting the power and the work of Jesus and being asleep on the job, so to speak. And so for us in our conversations, and as we wrestle with this text, we see in Mark chapter 14 this theme of Jesus being the Son of Man, and we see this tension of him being fully God yet fully man. And he shows us his power through a blend of having control, but also as he approaches suffering. And I think for us, we get a glimpse and an understanding of how do we walk into suffering. And so thank you for checking in on this video, and we will see you next time in Mark chapter 15.